ranging all across the classification area.
If you could talk into the mic, yeah, because we
A little bit better.
might not be able to get the audio otherwise.
Sure, no problem. So, so I've got about 15 years doing this for the U.S. government, and as I was doing some of this work, ranging from everything from red team testing to big enterprise security for huge logistics warehouses or actual operational areas that we have included forward operation bases, one of the things that I discovered is that we've been doing a fantastic job in the industry of creating some of these tools that address technical problems. However, we kept having this problem of the human being not being able to digest, or the tools not being created in such a way that I can digest and interpret meaning from the things that are occurring. We had great tools that are great applications. We didn't have great solutions. And as I looked at this more and more, it wasn't just an issue of the technical side of things. There was actually a human element that we were missing. And that's when I started talking to Joe here, who has a little bit of a different background.
So my path into this sort of realm is a little bit different. My background is in design. I went to design school, but I'm not contagious. Don't worry. I'm like this sort of right-brain guy that found my way into this domain. I started out making kind of 3D environments and objects for various game projects, which led into some UI work, which at that point I realized that people were actually having to use the things that I was creating. So I started digging into, well, how do we make usable things? What's the process behind that? Which kind of led me into this sort of user-centered design approach where you start kind of digging into users' heads and understanding exactly what they're trying to do, how they're thinking about the task you're putting them on, and really just all about their cognition about a given sort of task. From there, that sort of led into jobs creating software solutions for organizations like the CDC, the FAA, doing some airspace confliction for the guys defending the national capital region, that sort of thing. So kind of high-speed, data-rich environments, I guess you could say, which led me kind of to start crossing over into what the realm Frank was in. We talked a lot, and we started seeing, well, it sounds like some of the things we're doing are starting to converge a little bit. Like, I'm looking at these sort of problems from a design perspective. He was coming at the problems from a cybersecurity perspective. So we sort of intersected at this project that you see here, which I'll let Frank talk a little bit about.
So we started collaborating with a project out of DARPA. You guys may have heard of it before. It was called the Plan X program. And so originally Plan X was DARPA's attempt to say, hey, here's our problem. We are losing the cyber warfare battle globally and losing really badly. Part of the problem is there's just the adversary, as you might want to call it globally, has more people, more guys. They're just putting more energy into it than we are. We're not able to scale up to this problem. So we need better tools, more intuitive ways of approaching this data, and better ways to attack or defend at machine speed. And the biggest problem there was the human. So we have these sets of tools, and they divided one track into what they called intuitive interfaces, and they said, here's our problem. Our guys aren't smart enough to be able to fight at the speed that the machines are fighting. We need some way of perceiving this data, interacting with this data in a way that makes sense. And so we approached DARPA about, hey, we'd really like to solve this problem. And they said, hi, well, you're with a big old defense contractor, which we're not now, by the way, but you're with a big old defense contractor. That's really cute that you might want to come and solve this problem. Get out, because we're going to give this to the video game companies and all the cool guys that are coming up with these solutions. So we actually put together something based on the way that the user approaches, that we're kind of this odd pocket there, and this around the user's task, what Joe was saying before, how the user approaches the problem, the actual mission space for those Title 50 guys or the Title 10 guys. And this is what we came up with and actually won the contract. So our approach was radically different than what we'd been seeing in the industry and what the rest of the presentations were about, because it did take into account something that we kind of discovered along the way, and that's this concept of user-centered design, or using user-centered design to augment human performance. We recognize that the human being is not fast enough to conceive of this space, the complexity, the size of the amount of data that we're digesting. And so our approach was augmented human performance through user-centered design. So what's user-centered design?
Yeah, so user-centered design kind of has its roots back, kind of going back to early industrialization in the late 1800s. People started looking at, well, how do I take these kind of workers in this industrial environment and make them efficient. You know, how to design tools about that kind of take into account how they're standing, how they're moving. You know, how do we make them more productive just simply by the tools we make for them? And that was sort of ergonomics. And at that same time, psychologists started to study kind of cognition of tasks, started digging into people's motivation, how they conceive of their tasks, what sorts of things they needed to perform at a high level in an industrialized environment. Those two things sort of combined to form human factors sometime after World War I. So this started to be the way people thought about technology and technological solutions for workers. Eventually, that sort of found its way into Silicon Valley. A guy named Donald Norman, he's kind of a father of user-centered design, or UX if you've ever heard that term. He kind of took the ergonomics and psychological components that you saw in human factors and applied them to software. So that's kind of the historical roots of this approach.
Oh, I forgot to mention, by the way, at any time you guys have any interest at all, any questions, please feel free to interrupt Joe. And I mean, so if you guys, seriously, we would prefer that rather than just talking at you. If you guys have any questions, seriously, throw something at Joe. So we approach this with this user-centered design to address specifically these complex data problems. What we're doing is trying to, and really the purpose of this talk is to try to introduce a change in the way that we see the acceptability of the tools, because we want to make tools that are based on the user, that take into account the needs, the limitations of the specific user, and build tools that reduce complexity, that increase usability to allow us to comprehend and solve problems that are happening too fast, too big, or too complex for us.
And we see this approach a lot.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
See this approach a lot in the commercial industry for much lower stakes type of operations. So, you know, most software that you use on a daily basis, you know, as much as you might hate Outlook or something like that, those all have this process kind of applied to it. But then when you jump into these mission critical domains, things like cybersecurity, power and energy, you don't see those sorts of specialized tools that really would help push forward efficiency and help solve the problems in a better way that fits the users.
And the way that we do this user-centered design process is kind of, this is our process. This is the way that we handle it at Chimera with Joe and I. This is a process that has various flavors. You'll see something very similar to this in other design firms or with other challenges, but it works very, very well. And Joe, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we typically start with our user research, which, if we can, we actually embed with whatever particular user set we're designing for. One of the first projects that Frank and I worked on when we were still at the large defense contractors, we actually embedded with our cybersecurity operations center there for a few days and just watched how they worked through all three shifts. Kind of watched how they pushed data between each other, what tool sets they were using, what problems they were having, where their pain points were. And from there we were able to sort of define this base of knowledge that sort of our jumping off point for software design moving forward. And what we found was, and we'll get into it in a little bit, but the amount of data they were getting wasn't the problem. They had all the right data. They were just having trouble using it. So that sort of became our jumping off point. I mean, from there you just sort of, the mental models, the task flows, those sorts of things that flow out of that process are just deliverables that we use to kind of break down those kind of psychological processes going on in the user's head. And then from there we just move through design and deliver, and these sort of iterate on each other. They're all spinning along in a mechanical way. But that's sort of how we go from zero to delivered product.
The big takeaway is that this is a systematic process. This isn't just a one-shot, oh my goodness, those graphics were really cool, I really like that, can we replicate that because I saw it on Minority Report. This is a systematic process that we can apply and do again and again and again, and we hope that the industry would start to adopt this method of attacking the problem, because quite frankly, as Joe mentioned before, the tools that we see on the professional side, and I'm not trying to say the baby is ugly, I'm trying to say that all of the babies are ugly. So this is generally the problem we see on the professional side, is that for consumer grade products, we have these great intuitive tools, whether that's if I want to send an email or I want to play this track on my phone or I want to do some word processing. Those things are built in a very intuitive way. Things are where I expect them to be. And we see a massive drop-off on some of these professional tools. So the first thing that we kind of talked about, or that Joe was mentioning, was this idea of user research. This is a big departure from where we do traditional systems engineering, because traditionally, the guy that's doing the coding of the tool is the smartest guy. He knows exactly what that should look like, the way it should work. We recognize immediately we are not the user, although that's Angelina Jolie. I'm just going to point that out in case nobody's seen it. Has anybody else seen this movie? Like, Hackers, come on. I mean, it's classic.
Also,
you know?
Frank never had hair.
That's true. I was born like this, and it's aerodynamic. So one of the things that we recognize is that we are not the user, and Joe talked about embedding with the CSOC and what we found out there.
Yeah, so that really just taking that we are not the user mindset from a development standpoint is what enables us to kind of stand in the user's shoes, and that's really what we're advocating for tool development moving forward.
So one of the things that we identified, again, when we embedded with the CSOC there, is that they express that they are drowning in this data. Not that the data isn't there or that we don't have tools, but they do have 12 different screens with tools on each screen, and they're taking information from this one to this one and passing it on. And they were getting data, but not meaning. And so the big challenge that we had in augmented human performance was, how do we derive meaning from data? And so that's one of the things we wanted to address. Is this is most glaring and most visible in the area of data visualization. We see huge amounts of effort being put into data visualization nowadays, and they're all terrible, for lack of a better term. And so when we look at those, there's a reason why they're all terrible. The first one is the way that we do that perception visualization. How do we draw meaning out of that? So I wanted to give a couple of examples of why this is terrible. So the human being can only process a certain number of things on screen at one time, and that's actually age dependent in a very general standpoint. So the older generation that's kind of used to seeing less information on screen can see about 10 to 12 things going on screen at any one time. The younger generation can see upwards of nearly 300 things going on screen independently at one time. But there is way more than 300 things that are here. When you do this type of data clustering, as you see in a lot of common visualizations, it's very difficult to determine any value of this or interpret anything that's going on here. So it requires some measure of interpretation of what's going on in order to make it an effective visualization. I have to start nitpicking at this.
One of the things to remember is that this doesn't sit in an isolated case. These guys that are using this particular tool also had 4 or 5 spreadsheets open, which had multiple tabs. They also had 3 or 4 or 5 other tools that they were copying and pasting data between. So there's just a huge cognitive load to using these tools. Sorry,
So what is the age cutoff for what you're talking about? And wouldn't older people necessarily be able to generalize or summarize necessarily better than someone plus experience?
The cutoff is actually 26 years and 2 months. Once you hit 3 months, you just like plummet. I'm just teasing. No, it is a generalization. And so,
I mean, is it like a flat or is it just boom?
no, it really depends on the circumstance. And actually, you'll see a lot of it is based on the amount of interaction that they've previously had. So the folks that are really into gaming, they generally carry that a long way. And incidentally enough, the women are much better at perceiving just naturally. They have just better scores than men at perceiving different stuff on screen.
But in terms of the generalization, is there any generalization of where the age is 26 really?
No, I'm just totally making that up right now.
That didn't make any sense.
No, it really. No.
No, but I mean, in terms of user design, I have to design things for people.
Sure.
You know, one time when I was 30, I designed a course, and I'm up there teaching it. Somebody's like, hey, where do we get these under 30 fonts? And what it was, it couldn't see.
Sure.
It's like, well, why didn't you sit in front of the room? But anyway, you know, I learned, okay, I'm going to have to make all those courses be at least 12 point, because my customers aren't reading them because they're older, and their eyes are starting to go, or they sit in front of computers strong. But you know, it's a general rule that you don't give people 9-point reports. So is there...
I wouldn't say that there's a general rule. It really depends on the type of user. I mean, eventually when you make a product, it's going to be for...
a target to your demographic goal.
Right, but you don't know who's going to pick that up, whether it's somebody that has been gaming for a while. So it's just about finding that happy medium. So this is one of the things that the government especially loves is these different types of trees, or TAC trees, or these network trees. They love these for some odd reason, because you can jam so much data in here, and it seems like, look, I can see this entire picture of what's going on, but I can't interpret anything that's going on based on this type of display. But for some reason, they just love it.
A lot of people like to pretend they know what the hell's going
They're
on.
like, yes, that's very interesting. The green and then the red one. So this achieves kind of a cognitive static effect in the brain. So the brain will visualize this type of information, and it just kind of reaches a level of static. If there's not, so one thing that everyone will probably notice when they look at this is the one red box in the bottom left-hand corner, the second red box, and this big green block. That generally the brain is just targeted to those things that have a great degree of differentiation from the static noise. So this is kind of good if you were only wanting to pay attention to those red blocks, but other than that, it's these type of visualizations that actually make it more difficult to interpret anything. The last one is this idea of consequences to visualizations. So we spoke at the SMDC conference a couple of years ago, and we had this. There was this Air Force general up there, and he's talking to the industry, and he said, what I need from you guys is I need a better way where I can visualize where my cyber missiles and my cyber bullets and my cyber mortars, and I need to be able to move them on my map and fire and blow up the cyber guy. I wish I was making that up. The problem is it's not his fault. He's got what the industry has given him. He understands kinetic warfare. And so because he has a lack of information, or the information that's presented to him in a kinetic fashion, he starts to have consequences about the way that the cyber environment works. This is a big warning for how we do cyber operations from a global perspective and then from a kind of defense perspective. Is they have no idea, for the vast majority of people that are involved in the decision-making process have no idea of what this environment looks like. And it's because they're taking everything that they know. When we put a visualization of cyber assets on a map, we interpret visual elements about that. Well, if that's there and that's there, then that must be 10 miles apart. And so it takes me a little while to get there. Those type of visualizations have consequences in the way that we make decisions.
Well said.
Yay! So another issue is the right data, the wrong form. This is ether ape. This is, great visualization. So there's nothing wrong with the data that's presented here. The problem is the form. There's too much going on, and so it prevents me from making a decision. I use this in place of a CSOC Nmap feed that we had before. One of the problems that they had every day at 8 o'clock Beijing time was that all of a sudden this great big defense contractor would start getting hammered at 8 o'clock in the morning. All the hackers or whatever would get up in the morning and they would start hammering away at the firewalls. And they could just sit there and watch because they just had no ability to do anything with it because the data was not in the right form. Another issue that impacts our ability to perceive data is the right data or the wrong data at the right time. Like, hey, I've got an alert. This is something very important that you should pay attention to. So I've put up bad area code file vmc line 715. I have no idea what to do with this. There's no contextual information. Another good example is PC load letter. My PC load letter, I don't know what that is. What I've interpreted PC load letter to mean is that I take an axe to my printer. For the record, printers are the bane of my existence and I hate them. I'm sorry, that was kind of a personal editorial. This is another one of my favorites. This is a fantastic tool. You guys might be familiar with this particular tool. This is Wireshark. It's great for getting a microscopic picture of what's happening, but it's plagued with the problem that the vast majority of these cyber tools are built with, and that's they give you pieces of information without context or semantics as to what's important about this data. I really do want to rip apart this Wireshark application for its poor design element, but the biggest problem is that we're giving the users data in very isolated, separated packets. So it forces somebody that's trying to make a decision. Actually, we listened to a great talk earlier where a guy was using Elk and some tools with Elk to kind of make some of his decisions. And it struck me that we're taking information from this pipeline and then this pipeline and this pipeline, and we're forcing the user to hold that in cognitive working memory and, okay, I think I know what that's supposed to mean. Let me go take an action.
And this was something, as a designer, observing these guys work everywhere we went, in every operations center we sat in. This was the common problem and the common pain point that everybody pointed back to. I don't have context, I don't have context, I don't have context. You know, it's a forest for the trees problem repeatedly.
And the last one is actionable value. This is moving one step beyond the actual interpretation of the data for the human. This is the final piece, that it's a little bit beyond giving data meaning. This is obviously a picture of a denial of service attack underway. It's a super cool visualization. It's got lots of nice things that are going on. But the problem with visualization of data in an envelope like this, in a very discrete form, is I can't do anything with this. We're moving beyond design from a visual standpoint to more of an interaction design. When I see, okay, I'm obviously flooding this particular space from all these IP addresses, but I've given the user this apart from the means to do step 2, I've failed in terms of the user workflow. So when we looked at that design process, that's something that we take into consideration from the beginning. Is not, hey, I'm trying to make a tool that does X. It's, hey, how do I solve the user need Y? So, why does cybersecurity need user-centered design?
This is a quote by a guy. He actually runs, again, to go back to the term UX, user experience, which is sort of what user-centered design enables. So he's all about designing tools in whatever industry, basically to enable users. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do when we make a tool. But there's good ways of making tools, and there's bad ways. So what we're getting at here is attempting to make a better approach for this particular domain, which is rather extreme, as we'll talk about.
Yeah, our approach is essentially augmented human performance, like we had mentioned before. We want to make the human faster, smarter, more accurate. It seems a little bit science fiction-y, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't trying to actively advance the emergence of the singularity, because I totally am. As we have these tools where we're trying to interpret this data, when we have that block, there is a theoretical limit to what we can possibly manage. It's not like everything else that's out there. We believe that cyber users are what we would call extreme users of data. This, in fact, when we mentioned Jared Spool or Don Norman, those guys that are concentrated in the ideas of user-centered design or user experience, they're doing great jobs at building commercial tools for those simple problems. But we are in an area where we have created an animal that I don't think that we fully understand what we've created yet. The scope, the breadth, the speed, and the complexity of the internet space is far beyond what we can possibly imagine. It is extremely fast. It is extremely big. And when I start to convey those things to people, their eyes glaze over and they say, "You're boring. I'm going to move on to the next guy at the bar."
Well, the cool thing that, about this particular set of users in the cybersecurity field is that we consistently find that bright, fast, able to deal with massive amounts of information at once. And when you get the tools out of their way, they're even better.
So this is what we're trying to talk about in terms of those problems and why cybersecurity needs user-centered design badly. Most of the problems that we have that we're facing with design are these easy problems. How do I get my iTunes to work? Which iTunes, I don't like that anyway. But yeah, how do I get my iTunes to work? How do I send email? Those are small problems. And so there's what we call an intrinsic cognitive load of the problem. How difficult is the problem just in a vacuum? And then there's the germane cognitive load of the tool. How does my tool make it easier or harder to do that problem? Most of the tools that we have, there's the intrinsic cognitive load of our hard cybersecurity problems, and then there's bad design, which means that I have to think harder, I have to work harder, I have to do more things to work the tool. Joe gave me, you have that training example.
Well, one of the things we found when we'll say, for example, the airspace deconfliction tool that we worked on. It's not cybersecurity, but it's still dealing with a lot of information in a complex space. You don't want to get it wrong because then you shoot down an airliner. What we found is when we gave them the proper tools that kind of enabled them to intuitively see the airspace they're working with, filter it rapidly for specific amounts of information, they could stop using 6 weeks at the schoolhouse to train this kind of arcane and complex tool and actually talk about the real job. What are the tactics of my job? How do I develop situational awareness of my airspace? Those sorts of things. So the training actually shifted from training the tool to training the job, which is what we're looking for in this environment.
So for our purposes in cybersecurity, we don't have a easy problem, hard problem issue. We have a hard problem, extreme problem, where especially when we get kind of at the enterprise level or at the global level, just the volume of data that's being presented, the amount of things that are going on, they move us past our ability to design. There's a theoretical limit to what that usability could be. Everything past that is something that the government, a lot of the intelligence agencies are really enamored with this idea. And what we're calling this idea of system-supported decision-making or augmented human performance. And what we mean by system-supported decision-making is, as we break apart that user workflow, as we start to analyze where a user ingests information, makes a decision in cognitive working memory, and then outputs a response, there are things that the human does well, and there are things that the system does well. Oftentimes, the human is doing a lot of things that he does not need to be doing, or the system is not supporting. So what they're looking for is augmenting the decision-making capability of the human by providing system decision-making points, by digesting some of that information. We're not trying to offload everything to the system. We're trying to create essentially human-computer symbiosis. So I don't need to tell you guys that there's lots of the internet is big. There's security problems are all over the place, and your security is vulnerable. You guys have been to these things before. You know that you're professionals in this field. You know that these problems are big. You know that there's a lot of data that's passing. The problem is how do we introduce a mechanism that solves some of these problems that makes you guys smarter? I don't want to call anybody's baby ugly, but until we start to realize that there is a better way, it can be very difficult to interpret. We can look at that Kibana dashboard or look at Akamai or something like that. Akamai is actually not so bad. But look at some of these tools and think, hey, this is pretty good, until we realize that there is a world out there in which we do something even better. And we think that design is the path to that.
Yeah, and as we talked about, if you look back at the history of industrialization, we've always kind of applied, psychological processes, design processes to these, large problems of how people operate in an industrialized environment. So all we're saying is that, we're trying to bring this into what's definitely a more complex field, but we think the same techniques and apply.
So this is how we approach the problem, and this is how we believe you achieve augmented human performance. There's a system side component and a human component to this. On the system side, we have guys, especially that we've worked with, that do great development of algorithms. But the problem with an algorithm is it's only going to spit out information that you ask it to spit out. And unless you do an analysis of the user need, what are we trying to achieve, there's a risk that we're going to create an algorithm that generates something that I don't need, and we end up creating a technical problem or a technical solution for a problem that I don't have. So the first thing we do is we stop and we build these algorithms based on those user needs, which it looks like it's taking it backwards, but it's very effective.
And one thing to note is that while these are two separate lists, we believe that those two things should be kind of working hand in hand. As I'm designing, my algorithm, I should be considering user needs, but also when I come up with something cool and new that I can do, that might drive kind of the human side of that design. So it might drive my visualizations, for example. So there's definitely a push and pull between user needs and advancing technology and new techniques. So often design and development are set up at kind of loggerheads where they kind of bash into each other. But if done correctly, everything works great, and design kind of reaches into the guts of a system and influences the entire development of the tool.
And that's kind of one of the big differences when we do this type of user-centered design is we approach with an understanding of those cognitive limitations of the human being and apply that to the way that we construct our designs. The system doesn't need to visualize anything. It's a computer. Zeros and ones would be just fine. But however, we do these visualizations that really don't take into account those cognitive limitations of the user. It's better to have tons of data on there. So we find that some of these solutions are best solved. As we're building these type of solutions, we like to leverage everything else that's being done out there from the academic side along with industry stuff as a way of advancing our ability to augment this. And this is done very, very, very well in the field of gaming. So there's the big push to gamify everything, which in a lot of developers' minds means let's just give them like achievement points if they do something good, or give them like merit badges. That'd be awesome. Then they're going to really want to use my tool forever and ever. The great thing about gaming is the fact that it abstracts out those elements of things that I don't care about. Let me tell you, I've got a little garden in my backyard, and Farmville is much more fun than working in my stupid garden because those elements that I do not like are abstracted out to me. I can just concentrate on growing corn and all this kind of good stuff. That's one of the things that we feel is very strong about the gaming industry and where we can leverage for these professional tools that we use.
It's not just about fun, it's the abstraction of data actually can enable understanding if done correctly. So you're sort of, rather than having to look at entire lines of information, sometimes you can abstract those and kind of roll those up in certain ways. That's kind of what Frank's getting at, rather than just weeding his garden.
I just want to play games. Yeah. I'll move past this one. So let's look at an example from the gaming industry. We're going to flash forward past that one. This, does anybody recognize what this is? EVE Online. Nobody else? I was going to put up there Star Wars Galaxies, but then I'm super old if I put that up there. And there's like one other person here that's like, yeah, I played that. I'm old. Do you guys remember Pong? That game was awesome. And actually, that's a really great point. When we look at a game like Pong, that was a challenging game, and there's only relatively 8 different pieces of data that are going on there. Ball speed, ball direction. Is everybody familiar with Pong, or am I really just okay? Paddles like this. Everybody's looking like, what is he talking about? Paddles like this, ball goes back and forth. Yeah. So there are only 8 different pieces of data interaction: ball speed, ball direction, paddle location, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very simple game. However, it can be very challenging. At least it was for me when I was like 2. Anyway. So nowadays, modern MMOs have upwards of potentially thousands, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30,000 different pieces of data that you can be processed in one time, especially when you start to look at information in a 3-dimensional environment. You've got status, location of different organisms, dot effects on them, health, mana, all that kind of good stuff. But we don't drown in that data. We thrive because of the way that data is constructed, because there are abstractions and simplifications of the way that I absorb that data. It's still lots and lots of data, but I can make sense of it. In fact, I can even develop schemas, those ideas that if I put a game in front of anybody, they're going to be able to do the WASD, navigate around. There's that schema that's been formed in the brain. Without a level of simplification, we can't do that. So
it's also because the gaming industry has invested a ton of effort into getting every one of those user interactions right, into understanding exactly what those users need to do. I mean, they've got, typically there's a large investment in the psychological component where they're literally inviting people in and kind of picking their brains apart as they play games. So you see the result of that in intuitive interfaces. It's not to say they always get it right. Some just suck. But EVE Online is one that kind of gets it right. They're doing a lot of things, interesting things with very complex data, and the game is still usable and playable and fun because they invested a lot of effort into making it for those specific set of users.
So this isn't even complex on the scale that we have to deal with in the cybersecurity world or in bioinformatics or anything like that. But this is a pretty complex visualization here. This is basically the universe of EVE. And we did not do this following work, so we'll have to give credit to where it's due, but a user approached this and said, hey, I'd really like to be able to navigate more effectively through star systems. So how do I approach this problem of this level of complexity and make a tool that works easier for me? So the first thing that they did was abstract out some of the data to give where's my origin, and then some small, what we call data characterization, things that I'm interested, do I own this star system or not, and what star systems is it connected to. That was the first thing that was done. Now we've lost data if you take it from a traditional mindset, but what we've done is refined the approach. So go ahead.
Sorry. Well, the important mechanic here is that this tool made it very easy to manipulate a certain data set into specific ways. So we found that anytime you can kind of easily make or manipulate data, when you see that change, that actually leads to a lot of understanding. When I can kind of shift things, shift parameters, filter the data, interact with the data in an easy way, and see the change over time or over my actions, that really brings forward a lot of understanding. And that's what they're attempting to do here, I think pretty successfully, as you'll see.
So in step 2, they reorganized the data. It's all exactly the same, but he's refined it to his current user workflow. This is at the center, that's his location. He's trying to come up with a very intuitive way of determining where I've got to jump to get to one location to another. So this center piece, it moves based on his current location and where he might want to go. So that just that reorganization of data from here to here has instantly given a huge amount of information about, oh, okay, I can understand what I need to do with this in terms of navigation. And then the last piece is abstracted one more time so that he has a handy little tool to aid him in navigating from one spot to another in the EVE universe. He had a defined need, the ability to navigate very successfully, and he took that same data and by refining it and abstracting the data and refined to the way that he needed it, he's able to give himself a tool that gives him better performance in that environment.
Yeah, it's just right data at the right time, fit it exactly into his workflow, which is kind of the core goal of everything that we're trying to do.
So another great example is WoW, looking at the way that they do this interface. I do like to say that WoW isn't the first player in the game in terms of MMOs, but they perfect the experience associated with it, and it is because of that huge level of investment. You see, everything about this is done in such a way as to make this a enjoyable experience. The things that we take for granted are those things that make it very easy to interpret that 30,000 different pieces of data that I mentioned earlier. Everything from the simple iconography, which conveys messages, we're able to determine, hey, these are the current effects that I have on me at this time. Where everything moves from a tactical focus to a strategic focus. That's all about the placement of information. You want to talk some more about this?
Yeah, it's just it all comes back, like I said, placement of information. Tailored to a specific workflow. I mean, that's what this really comes down to. And these guys are really inside their users' heads. They've kind of iterated over time. They've watched how these guys play. They understand. They're probably gamers themselves. They really understand the problem space that they're working for, and they've made tools specific to that. Now, some of the abstractions are very fanciful. You know, that goes to the gaming industry. We're not necessarily advocating that you have to create a game-like interface for cybersecurity, but we are advocating those topics of data abstraction and workflow.
Yeah, and we did, I'll just to short circuit anybody, we did have somebody say, well, this is a great idea, though. We should make it like cybersecurity, like an MMO, and you can run around and you can have your sword, and it can be different, antivirus tools, and you could chop viruses, and you could run around and then form your party. And I'm like, no. No.
People are serious.
Yeah. Well, get out. You're done. You lose 10 points. So this isn't all bad. I mean, this is a visualization very similar to what we've seen before, and we think that the adoption of these types of principles are getting in the right direction. We see a very similar data clustering to what we saw before, but we have the added benefit of different correlations where the red thing, this point in time, the location, we see that indicator given in a bunch of different ways so that I can interpret this data. Much more clear approach to how this is presented. So it's not all doom and gloom. Most of the babies are a little bit ugly, but some of the babies are getting prettier.
Well, the thing we found that a tool like this can enable is what seems to be most effective for, well, in particular, operation centers, which is sort of where a lot of our work happens. Anytime you can kind of take that user from 30,000 feet down to, 1 millimeter back out to 30,000 feet very quickly, and enable them to move through the data very quickly, that really increases effectiveness. So you do that through multiple views of data, like you see here, intuitive interactions with the data, and we're not even advocating collecting different sorts of data. Often the data that they already have is perfect, it's fine. They just need ways to control it and manipulate it more intuitively. Can I say intuitively one more time? I don't know.
One more time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's even right here on the slide.
Yeah. So our real, I'm trying to approach the summary a little bit. We're not trying to advocate anything other than introducing this industry to beyond the STEM kind of capability set. We believe that in order to build these type of interfaces, in order to build effective understanding and digestion of these tools, we've got to open our arms a little bit wider to include those folks in the fields of cognitive psychology, the visual and interactive designers, guys like Joe, data scientists. We think all of these things are necessary and are going to give us a better approach to it. Right now, we do see kind of a cybersecurity that field. There's this own little niche group of folks that have a high degree of skill in this area, and we feel that broadening past the STEM to get some of those folks in the liberal arts building into helping solve these problems is going to benefit us. So we have a couple of things that from our creation that we wanted to demonstrate. This first one, I guess you can talk about that.
So this was, it appears a little bit fanciful, and it was meant to be. On this particular project, we were basically just asked to envision what is 5 to 10 years, what might this look like, without actually having to execute it, which was awesome. For the Plan X, yeah. So this is like pure conjecture based off of, but it is based off solid user research. So we actually went to Fort Meade and sat with a lot of the Air Force guys actually conducting cyber operations for the Air Force, and sort of really try to dig into what exactly they were doing and how they worked. So the thing we came out of from that is that a lot of these guys they might be dealing with the same general data set, but based on their jobs, they've got very specific things that they're doing in very specific ways of looking at that data. So you can see here there's sort of what we call, it's just an ecosystem of data. So you've got people consuming the data in various ways. You've got a guy sitting at this giant touch table which has an abstracted game board on it. We sort of base the game board off of Civilization or other 4X gaming games in the genre, which was actually, again, going back to that particular user set, that was something that a lot of the guys played. Civilization, Command and Conquer, they really understood that 4X metaphor. So we kind of leveraged that into this wider view of their mission, so that game board would change based on mission parameters. And in the back, you've got guys kind of doing work on traditional workstations. It's also got a large data wall at the front. So the idea is that I can have this whole ecosystem of devices and interactions built around the same set of data to kind of enable their specific jobs, which is really what we're trying to do. And in each of these solutions, there's a specific user need tied to that. So one of the things that Joe noticed when he was embedded with the Cybersecurity Operations Center is at each shift change, there was this dialogue of information about here's what's going on, and papers flying everywhere, and spreadsheets of data, and very difficult to convey status, especially in terms of passing on a shift. And so they brought in a touch table. I don't know if you guys remember, it was the Microsoft Surface and the Microsoft Pixel Sense, which is now being used to play like table poker on or something like that. But it's the ability to design agnostic from a technology or agnostic from a particular solution is we can introduce things like that. And so Joe created a environment
very similar to this type of approach with a hexagonal game field, where it had just very primitive representations of the things that were going on in the network, so that they could, instead of saying, hey, I've got this sheet and this is going on here, you could very quickly and accurately represent these are the things that are going on in the network in an environment that was very collaborative. So we wanted to leverage that type of approach here.
We sort of stopped them from going workstation to workstation and looking over each other's shoulders, and kind of put them face to face so that they could talk about network issues for 5 to 10 minutes and just change the shift and move on with their day, rather than having to kind of disrupt the entire flow of the operations center.
So in the same way, one of the things that we were asked by DARPA was, hey, we want to be able to see the entire internet all at the same time. And so I said, okay, well, that's 83 billion X nodes. Right now, if I do that for you, I'm going to need, a screen that's 1 pixel per. I'll need a screen the size of the Superdome, give or take. And they said, oh, well, we're DARPA. We don't care. That's not our problem. Go away. So I said, okay. So one of the things that we came up with was the idea of using some of these more organic metaphors as a way of representing this data. This in particular is a concept design for dynamic morphology that essentially shifts based on the perspective of the user. Essentially, the entire internet is there, but the only representations that I currently see right now are the ones that are important to me, this kind of yellow branching sector. So everything else is just kind of trunked away and abstracted because I don't need it. And if you look at some of these things on the right, the mission attributes and the Operation Low Volt, that's direct takeaway from those guys, the user research that we did for the guys in Fort Meade. Generally, they had basic training, and probably 3 to 4 years of specialized training, and then they were being thrown these tools that had in the weeds hashes and hex code and all kinds of other stuff. They had no clue what that stuff was, but they were being asked to digest that along with everything else. So our solution is to abstract some of that data and give variables, because these guys are trigger pullers essentially from a cyber standpoint. All they needed to see was kind of the impact effects. Sorry.
But particularly you guys doing this, is there not a point where you just tell the customer? I gotta wonder sometimes by looking at this and hearing this, is that are we overcomplicating it by trying to oversimplify it? As a design guy, you can say, no, stop. That's way too much stuff. How about I have 7 displays with 7 guys, so it's at least 1 continent each for the internet. Doing that all at once is such a high level of abstraction, it's kind of useless.
Right, exactly.
Where do your brains explode when the customer says that? You can't answer the question, but isn't there a place where you say no?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where we stand on the user research. So
It depends on how much money they have, too.
Right.
So it's like, oh, yeah, okay, no problem.
So we can point to our study of these guys, and we can say, all right, well, these guys are capable of processing, X amount of data in these specific ways, and this is how they sort of think about what they're doing. We can recommend a solution from there. We're actually standing on something solid if we get to do that properly, rather than just, what we want to get to is it's not an objective process or a subjective process. It's very objective. So we're stepping through this, systematic way of thinking about users and what they're doing and how to create solutions for that. And that, once we can show that, that typically is enough to convince customers that we can move forward in the way that we're suggesting. Obviously, there's compromises, but.
So we continue that abstraction with a representation like this. I mean, the whole idea behind this was that some of those attributes, when we're bringing systems on task, especially with DARPA's direct need, going back to the start of the talk, was, hey, I need to be able to talk at machine speed. Leveraging from something like Madden, where they could have the attributes of those different attacks queued up and just put on a specific node and loaded that way, made for a much quicker, much more streamlined approach to doing direct cyber attacks. So that's one of the reasons we believe it was so effective with getting the ear of the customer, because it addressed these problems of reducing the complexity of understanding the data and moving on.
And again, we weren't trying to solve how do you do cyber warfare. We were trying to solve how do you conduct cyber warfare operations for these guys. Like, there's probably more complex things happening at different levels, but for this specific set, they needed something a little more abstract.
So I know we're running low. Are there any questions? By the way, thank you guys very much for listening. And do you guys have any questions at all? Yes, sir.
I love what you're doing. I think it's beautiful. I think it's much needed. streamlining of data for presentation purpose, are we going to lose those underlying simple, you know, you look at that, those first visualizations, and most of us have seen that kind of representation. We don't know everything we're looking at, but we're looking at every piece of it.
Right.
Now, you know, talking about the farming game. When you love the game because you don't have to weed, you don't have to fertilize, you don't have to do those underlying basic things, but you got to have somebody looking at logs.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the
You know what I'm
things.
saying?
Absolutely.
Am I making sense to you?
Yeah, you're
You know-
absolutely correct. One of the ways we sort of approach that, and Frank can probably talk better to this, but you know, one of the things we want, we hate visualization for the sake of visualization because of that very reason. So in some cases, we're just trying to get you into the right area. Rather than having to look here, we might just say, maybe look here. And yes, you are going to have to eventually get all the way down into the logs, absolutely. But maybe you don't, maybe your net is smaller, or your haystack is smaller. That's kind of what we're trying to do.
And to kind of follow on with that, the log for me, that's kind of my holy grail because I hate it so much. And so I want to address that problem. But when we talked to the guys that were involved with some of the target security breach stuff, it was very difficult for them to interpret that anything was going on at the exfiltration step of the data because maybe 1%, maybe a third of a percent of the data in the logs is related to that. So having a better way of parsing through all that information, having a separate tool for that, that's going to be critical. So yeah, I definitely agree with you, and that's going to be a problem that we have to address. I don't want to go over it and they're going to throw some at me. So thank you again. If you guys have any questions, hit us up. So, yeah.